Let's look at another scenario. After d3 and knight c6, white can play bishop g5 as move 4. Black goes on with d5, so the usual move. There's several things that can happen now. There's going to be another video about this specific d3 move against the Nimzowitsch, and there's going to be a million of other videos that I'll be making. So if I can't really go through all of the moves right now, then that means you're just gonna wait for the next one. Now I'm going to go through this, which is the best move, by the way. e5, attacking the knight, and the pawn's protected by the knight. So knight d7, d4 blunders a pawn, by the way, because after a swap of pawns, then you got two knights attacking e5, and the knight will not be supported, and the pawn in e5 will not be supported. So after knight c3, very normal move, attacking the pawn, and this pawn cannot play e6 to defend the pawn naturally because the bishop will be taking the queen. Now black kicks out the bishop, and now he will happy to go for such kind of attack like g5 and get rid of the bishop and then play e6 for real. Black continues with g5 anyway, bishop to g3, and now e6. This is fine for black. Black's putting a lot of pressure on the e5 square, and d4 cannot really happen. Besides, black will increase the pressure on the e5 pawn with the bishop in fianchetto. So if white plays, for example, bishop e2, this is already punished. With bishop g7, we have too much attack over the square e5, and we're going to win the pawn. It's important to notice that d4, after being taken, the queen cannot take back because of the knight. So after the knight takes back, the knight is no longer defending e5. So we're going for that pawn. So white is now forced to play the move queen e2 to safeguard the pawn. But that's blocking the bishop, and this bishop doesn't really have a possibility to do any fianchetto. So white player is smothered, and this bishop is suffering particularly. After queen e2, we still play bishop to g7, and after long castle, the most logical move, potentially put the rook on the same file of the pawn, black castles too. Black now has a familiar plan. If black were to play again now, the move will clearly be b5. It's one of those plans where the knight can't take the pawn is going down inevitably, and if the knight takes the pawn, black has rook to b8 attacking the knight, and when the knight moves back, queen b6 is putting white under tremendous pressure, and black has a winning attack. It's white to move though, and one may argue that a good move for white could be h4, trying to start swapping stuff around the king side and make use of this rook, because there is no other way for this rook to develop. It's just because there's no way for this bishop to develop. Well, that's a blunder, because now black continues with g4, so of course we're not going to open the files for white. We're not doing him favors. Now the knight will lose control of the square e5, and we will be able to take it with our knight. And well, a sacrifice here doesn't work, because we can just take the knight, and after pawn takes back, we can take back with our queen. So this idea, typical idea of the queen infiltrating and then going for an attack with the rook, doesn't really work in this case. We have too much attack over g5, and so h4 is wrong. So white's best move now is the obvious king b1, and black continues with the plan b5. The position of the black player is advantageous. Black has a solid advantage and is being able to create through this Nimzowitsch Sicilian, where white defends the pawn with d3. You just have to create this center. White's best move to push the pawn in e5 at the beginning of the line allowed us to create this center, and the control we have of the square d4 allowed us to make sure this pawn never came down, and pushing this h6 g5 pawn with the bishop in fianchetto has allowed us to have full control over the square e5. So after knight f6 and d3, fairly logical, and it's a move I've encountered many times, especially by players who haven't studied this fully, and the vast majority of white players who play e4 are not prepared against the Nimzowitsch, so that's one extra reason for you to start playing it. After knight c6, white can now play the move c3. I've also encountered this very often, and also this kind of puts more attack over the square d4. So that seems to be making sense. Now black plays this setup, e5. We have now full control over the square d4, and white has nothing but a pyramid that can never really start. So this pawn here will be taken. We've got an attack on the square e3, on the square e4 as well. So after the normal development of the bishop to e2, black continues with d5. White has no reason to take the pawn, and if he were to do so, then we'd be improving the position of our pieces, but we will eventually go through that. After castling, black continues with bishop e7, And white here can only think of playing bishop g5, but then give up the bishop pair when we forced the swap. We're happy to start pushing these pawns, right? In this setup, it's just fine to do so. And so after knight b2 d2 and castle, white is kind of stuck. Best move according to the engine is a3. Obviously, white is thinking about plans like b4, because he can't really ever break the center. He's going to have to start an attack on the side. In fact, our control of the square d4 allowed us to stop these two pawns from advancing, unless white wants to play a silly setup with this reverse pyramid, but that will punish this light square bishop forever. And also, why not the other one? So after a3, best move in a bishop e6. White's idea of playing knight to g5 is simply met by bishop d7 very quietly, and then we will eventually kick the knight out and go back to e6, keeping control of this situation. White can now have an idea of playing f4, but this doesn't work, because you may think that white is trying to get some more space, but after f4 we can take the pawn, and the rook can't really take back because of h6 attacking the knight, and now the knight will have to go to such a weird square like h3, opening the file of the king. Problem is that now after knight f3, knight h5 traps the rook, whereas if knight goes to h3, black continues with knight e5, improving the position a lot. Now let's remember that in this position, d4 seems possible to play because the pawn in e5 is gone, but that's not actually true. d4 is simply taken. Pawn takes back is met by queen b6, putting more and more pressure. And of course, a queen trade doesn't really work here because we can still take the pawn. And after knight b3, this loses to bishop a4. So going back a few moves, white can't really try and swap knights in order to give more freedom to this bishop because of knight g6 winning the exchange. And so the rook will have to go all the way back. Black can now finally take the knight, and after pawn takes back, black's plan is to simply play knight g6 now. Potential ideas for improvement of setup will be queen d7, rook to d8. White likes to leave things like this in the center. Being taken means to be able to take back with the knight. And so what does white do now to gain some more freedom? Black already has an advantage of something like about a piece. White may think of playing bishop g4 or maybe queen to e1 or even knight to f3. After a move like queen e1, rook e8 is the best move. Still keeps attacking the pawn in e4 and preventing the development of this knight. Again, we're really happy to be taken so we can take back and place a knight in a very productive square. The idea now is to play bishop to d6 and chase after this pawn, preventing the development of this knight. A move like bishop to g4 is actually met by knight takes, uniting white's pawns, because what happens after queen takes, then we can take the pawn here. And well, if knight takes, we can take the pawn for free. There's no compensation for white, no attacks that are scary enough. We're going to double up the rook soon. If pawn takes, white has an isolated pawn, and these two pawns looks terrible. And then black still plays queen to d3, infiltrating and then developing the rooks. So in this scenario, after pawn takes back, black continues to queen d7, puts pressure on this pawn. We can't really go for that pawn yet, but we're planning to play knight to e5 and then eventually centralize the rooks. The queen can't really move away like b3, for example, because of the check. The knight can't really move without allowing a check. And a move like h3 creates a very serious problem because black can now capitalize with rook to d8 and attack this file. The idea is still the same, to take e4 and then go for the pawn in d3. And if the pawn takes back and queen d3 comes with an infiltration of the queen, which is very strong.